I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I am Sunil Dasgupta. After an episode critiquing Washington Post's news coverage, we bring you three voices from behind the news this week. First, from Kyiv in Ukraine, Maria Nazarova, where she's furiously training people in tactical medicine, which is about triaging war injuries. Second, David Moon, a Maryland legislator who found his bill on court transparency suddenly plugged by Grammy winner Fiona Apple and Oscar-ignored Jamie Lee Curtis. And lastly, Jud Ashman, the mayor of the city of Gaithersburg, ponders over the city's persistent low voting turnout. And for that interview, we have back on the show our once up-county reporter, Andtew Saundry.
Claim to the wasteland of a planet. There's a world on the edge of the stellar maps, left alone ever since the empire fell.
If you're new to the show, I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools, and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians, but no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. It is my hope that this podcast will help those who feel left out reconnect in our local communities. Music for this episode comes from Bad Robot Jones, a Washington, D.C. area band of escaped androids on the run. Mixing punk, progressive, and indie rock, they play songs about assassin robots, Vulcan rituals, and the fall of galactic empires. Zach Parkman on vocals and guitar, Doogie Whittaker on bass and vocals, and Joey Jenkins on the drums. You are listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. We are going to skip our usual news roundup this week since all our interviews are newsy on their own. Maria Nazarova is a former Ukrainian army medic who was in the Washington, D.C. area when her country was invaded by Russia in February. She returned to Kyiv March 3rd and has been running tactical medicine training all day long for several days. After an exhausted day recently, I was able to catch her taking a small rest. Maria Nazarova, welcome to I Hate Politics. I want to begin by asking you about your life before the war. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself, where you lived, what you did for a living, family?
Okay, so I'm military medic. I used to be a combat medic, military medic in the army. And then I worked for police. I trained police in first aid. Then I worked for Ministry of Defense. And we developed a program of training for combat medics in the army. So I was like project manager for Ministry of Defense for military medical department. Then I worked for Comeback Life Foundation as chief of Veterans Department, and now I am deputy chief of government institution. It is called Ukrainian Veterans Foundation. It's a government-funded foundation which gives money for veterans for their projects, like business, social projects, whatever. When the intervention of Russia began, I was in Washington, D.C., it was a work visit with the Congress Leadership Center. So I was about to exchange experience in help for veterans in Washington, D.C. and then Texas. But the intervention happened, and we decided, me and my colleagues, we decided to return back to Ukraine, stop the program, and return back to Ukraine. So we bought like a lot of medical stuff because I remember from 2014 when the war began that there was lack of first aid kits, tourniquets, parts of medical backpacks, first aid kits. So we bought that all in DC, and it was 55 suitcases, almost a ton, like 1,000 kilograms. And we brought all of that to Ukraine just by plane.
And you arrived back in Ukraine, you said, in the beginning of March?
Yes, because first of all, we wanted to buy as much as possible of medical stuff, and then the road was very long. It was almost 3 days that we were in the movement. So we flew from Washington to Frankfurt, then to Warsaw, and then from Warsaw we went by car to Przemysl. It's a small city on the border with Ukraine. And then from there, we took train to Lviv in western Ukraine. And then we took train from Lviv to Kyiv. So it was really a long, long road.
And the Kyiv that you had left had changed?
Of course, it's much less people. Like, it's not as crowded as always, because I'm very used to living in like a big city, which is full of people. So it was very uncommon that so few people, and that public transport is not working as usual. So it's working, but like very limited, less cars, and there are also these checkpoints in some parts of the city where you have to show your documents and everything. So everything has. There were also attacks on civil buildings in Kyiv, just normal houses where people live, and we've seen that. So this is something very, very unusual. Like, I don't want to be too pathetic, but I mean, I'm not like afraid of military engagement, like the combat and everything, because I've seen that. I've been there before. It's just very different from what I've seen, because first of all, it's my city where I grew up. Then it's a very peaceful city, which was peaceful like all the time, all these 8 years that we are fighting Russia in the east of Ukraine. Kyiv and other cities were absolutely peaceful, and you could never tell that this is a country where war goes on and people die. And the third thing is that we have never seen aviation. I mean, like the war was very harsh these years, but it was only artillery, rockets, tanks, and else, but not aviation. So this is something that my brothers, sisters, and aunts also have never seen. This what I discussed with my military friends and veterans friends. That aviation is like absolutely different. It's the other level. There are air raid sirens all the time. I sometimes sleep over them. Like I don't I sleep so well that I don't hear them. But like a half an hour ago, I have seen anti-rocket launching. Like it's our weapon from like which protects us from rockets of Russia, and I've just seen them like going on the sky.
So are you in your apartment, home that you had before, or are you in a different location now?
I'm in a different location. I don't want to be alone in the house now, so I'm with my friends and colleagues, like in quite a safe place as it may be in such situation. But I've been in my apartment, checked everything, and left.
Do you have access to a bomb shelter or something that is close by? How does that work? When you hear an air raid siren, do you rush? Where do you go?
Yeah, like there are many bomb shelters. Like it's mostly the basement of the building. But sometimes if you don't have very quick access, or some people just like go to a safer place in the building, like between the walls in the middle of the building, like not standing by the window or by the door, but going somewhere where it's safer in the building. And of course, there are people who are elderly or people with disabilities that just cannot rush so fast. A sister of my grandfather is now in Kiev, and she lives alone on 11th floor, and the elevator is not working now, so she has no access.
Are you having power cuts?
No, not in Kiev, but like in her house, it's somehow this way. I don't know why, but we offered multiple times to evacuate her, to bring her to a safer place, and she just doesn't want. And this is something which is quite common, like even in the cities which are now totally destroyed, like near Kiev. You might have heard Bucha. There are small towns with where people live, and they mostly like work in Kiev and live there outside. And these towns are like almost completely destroyed and very unsafe. And there are still a lot of people who don't want to evacuate because they want to stay by their house. Some of my friends, like civilian people, not military, are helping with evacuation in these towns. So, of course, the military and the rescue services arrange the time, transport, and everything. But my friends, just as volunteers, they go to these towns and they just knock on doors and say, like, we're volunteers, we can bring you out. And they ask people to pack their things up and go with them. And they tell every day that there are people who say, I want to stay. This is very, I don't know, it's very, I can explain it.
Of course, they want to stay by their home. I understand. Where is the rest of your family? Are they are they in Kiev as well, or have they moved elsewhere to be safe?
My mom and grandmother have moved. That's my whole family. My mom and my grandmother, they moved to the West, and they're safe. My mom is volunteering also for this Comeback Life Foundation. She's professor in university. And because there are no lectures now, she works in call center for volunteer work. And the people in that call center say she's the most tolerant and, very, very kind to all people who are calling. My boyfriend is here with me in Kiev, and he's also a combat veteran. He was in army in 2014, 2015. And he now works for helping to. He works for this Comeback Life Foundation, and he specifically works with armed units like snipers, something like that.
You mentioned Bucha. That's occupied by the Kadyrovskis, right?
He personally, or his soldiers?
No, his soldiers.
Yes, I haven't seen them personally, but there are videos, and armed forces affirm that they have written about that, and yeah, that's true. But armed forces say they burn just like others, so no need to be very afraid of them.
You mentioned that you had combat experience earlier in eastern Ukraine, maybe Donetsk or somewhere else. And you say the biggest difference between then and now is the Air Force.
Yes, the aviation, yeah. I mean, like, it's very different. It's like, it's open intervention, not that, like before Putin always said, we are not there. These are some green people, green soldiers, what he said. But now it's fully open, and for some moment, I might sound like a very bad person, and I understand that, but for some moment, I thought there is like, if there is something, if you can find something good in this situation, is the thing that we are not anymore explaining that this is Russia who attacks us, because it's open. Because like for me, it was always clear who we are in war with, and it was Russia, and that's what we have seen since 2014 in Eastern Ukraine and Crimea. Of course, everyone here wishes it never happens, but I just think, like, in diplomatic way, this is the beginning of the end of Russian invasion and of Russia itself. I think I've said this multiple times, and again, not pathetic or anything like that. I genuinely believe Russia has already lost, and we have already won in perspective, diplomatically, on international, relationship and everything, economically as well. I think it won't be that one clear way. It will be a mix of political and martial military decisions. So it will not be like flawless victory with putting weapons down, and it won't be like fully diplomatic, because Russia isolates itself from all world conventions, organizations, and etc. And again, I don't see a clear way. I just know where we wanna put like the point in the story, and this is Ukraine reestablishes its borders and starts renovating itself, being reborn, and of course reparations and sanctions for Russia for more and more years.
I know you're training other medics, but apart from that, is there something you're looking forward to tomorrow and day after tomorrow?
I'm going to a massage. I asked my friend who stayed in Kiev, and he's a professional masseur, and I asked him to come to this volunteer foundation, because these are people who, like, 24/7, they're working on their computers, or carrying some big boxes of protective equipment, and they truly, all of them, they need good back massage. So I asked my friend to come make this. We opened this center. It's like a military unit, tactical medicine training center. We opened it in 2017, and in 5 years, all of our graduates were alive. We did not have any losses. In 3 weeks of war, we have more than 10 losses of my graduates, of medics. I must say, I don't really feel like I'm in my right place, because I wish, like, I'd rather be with a unit working now in the field, and probably will. And I just wanted to finish all of that training work here.
Maria Nazarova, thank you for taking the time. I wish you safety.
Thank you so much. I don't know about safety, but I wish ourselves victory.
That was Maria Nazarova in Kiev, Ukraine. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. I'll be back with Maryland Delegate David Moon to talk about support for his bill from Hollywood. David Moon, I hear you have some Hollywood support for your bill on court transparency. What's going on?
Well, on its face, it's a pretty simple request. We have some advocates in Maryland who are trying to get and maintain their ability to watch court proceedings on Zoom. That's it. That's the bill. Somehow this topic has brought the attention of Grammy Award-winning musician Fiona Apple, Jamie Lee Curtis, the actor, left some voicemails for the Judiciary Committee. And actually, beyond them, there have been dozens and dozens of pages of calls from ordinary residents now weighing in support of this legislation. So it's been quite an unexpected turn on a fairly pedestrian but important topic.
Can you explain what's at the root of this bill that you're trying to push through?
Sure. On its face, this is a pretty simple request. It's about whether the public should be able to watch court proceedings via Zoom or some other virtual method, or do they have to actually physically show up themselves and sit in a physical courtroom in order to have that access? That's what the bill does essentially. But I will admit that oversimplifies the question quite a bit, because it does in fact raise quite a number of more complicated questions about government. The judges right now have pretty broad discretion to allow or disallow people to see various parts of proceedings. And I'll give you some examples of how this plays out in the real world. When I was in law school a couple decades ago, one of my professors said, one of your assignments is just simply observe a proceeding, any proceeding. I just don't think you should be able to graduate law school without having stepped into a courtroom and seen what this looks like. He said, I don't care what you do, civil, criminal, whatever. I literally just walked into the first courtroom I saw, sat myself down, and was prepared to, check the box and move on. And the lawyer and judges looked startled to see me in there. And they both looked at me, and the judge said, who is this? And I said, oh, I'm sorry, I'm just a law student. I'm here to observe any court proceeding, and yours is the courtroom I've walked into. And one of the lawyers said, Your Honor, this is a very private matter. This is not acceptable. Could you please remove this young man? The judge said, sure. And I got removed from the courtroom, walked into the next one, and I have no idea, I don't even remember what was going on there, but they let me into the next one. So this sort of discretion of the judge would be maintained in what I'm trying to propose here, which is just where the public is already allowed to attend the proceeding. Should they be made to do it in person? I think this is the real customer service modernity question that all of government is now facing post-COVID.
Right. It's a pandemic COVID question, right? Prior to the COVID, we didn't have Zoom broadcast of court proceedings, ever. So this is like a COVID innovation.
100%. And the courts have obviously been resistant to allow this to begin with, but because of COVID, they had no excuse and started offering it en masse. All sorts of things that were resisted for years in Maryland suddenly happened. Electronic notarization happened overnight after years of resistance from state government, right? Things like that. And the courts were suddenly providing Zoom access.
I hear Fiona Apple is a court watcher, and how she got to this is because, that they are going to be denied now to watch the court on Zoom. So she is, pushing your bill.
Well, yeah, and let me be really clear too about where the credit goes for this initiative, because it's really wonderful when Fiona Apple, Jamie Lee Curtis come in, and they really did, put some real steroids into this whole conversation once they brought celebrity firepower into it. And, again, calls started pouring into the House Judiciary Committee as a result. But these women from Prince George's County actually for years now have been trying to elevate a whole range of not so sexy issues related to the conditions of those incarcerated. So Kiana Johnson has this organization, Life After Release, that's really trying to improve conditions for people, have prosecutorial accountability, judicial accountability. And there's this project that came of it, Court Watch Prince George's. And so, again, if we look at life before and after the pandemic, this woman, Carmen Johnson, would sit there in person by herself at hundreds of hours of hearings in order to try and ensure that bail review determinations were being done fairly. Now, just think about this, right? Every criminal defendant is going to go through this bail review where whether they're held in jail or released before trial, there's going to be a decision, right? So these trials aren't immediate. Now, there has been some fear that judges are just willy-nilly putting people in jail ahead of their trial without a good reason. In other words, they're not a public safety threat. There's no reason to believe that they're going to flee town or anything like that. This is not someone with a recidivism history, but who's there to actually monitor that on a macro scale that this is happening? And so once the pandemic brought in Zoom access, Ms. Johnson had dozens of volunteers who could actually sit on Zoom and monitor a much larger scale of these hearings. And so if you're and look, here's some of the interesting nuance that came out from the bill hearings. These activists have actually, through this monitoring process, have brought the judges to a much higher compliance with the bail review rules than before all of these activists were monitoring their behavior. And so it has changed behavior. And so this transparency has actually brought real accountability to the judiciary. So I think once you do that, it may ruffle some feathers. Some folks may not like that. And so here we are.
Right. So I believe the chief judge of the Maryland Court of Appeals, our Supreme Court, wrote a letter against this.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to argue separation of powers arguments that.
But what is the separation of power argument here?
That this would be the legislature telling the judiciary how it must run its internal operations and rules.
From a, intrusion perspective, when does the legislature actually intrude in judicial matters? For instance, does sentencing guidelines, where do they come from? Or bail review guidelines, are those independently developed, or, are those also subject to similar separation of powers questions?
You raise very, very good questions. I mean, the underlying sentences come from us. And so in many ways, the judges often come in and say, we don't make policy. You do that. We're implementing the things you do. And so it's really hard to tell where these lines exactly get drawn. And in the case of bail review guidelines, for example, we had bills to directly legislate this. Some of them were mine. You can or cannot do X, Y, and Z.
The genie's out of the bottle, and now you're trying to put it back.
Those who try to put the genie back in the bottle on Zoom convenience after all we've been through, are really doing so at their own peril, and they are really fighting upstream. I think it's a losing battle. They may be able to hold out for a little bit longer, but certainly this is not going to last. I mean, employers are seeing this with shifts in what they have to promise to woo workers these days via virtual access where possible. The Senate tried to walk back virtual live streaming and hearing testimony this past month, and there were wild protests. I was really surprised they were trying it, and here we have the courts doing the same thing. To be fair, the courts are starting in a little bit of a different position. Some of the courts were providing this alternative Zoom access. Some still don't really have the technology set up to do it. And so, the bill in some ways is trying to maintain Zoom access in places like Prince George's or Montgomery. Anne Arundel, I think, is not set up exactly for that. And so we're trying to get it in places like that.
So would your bill then compel Anne Arundel to Zoom broadcast?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And it would not be a broadcast, to be clear. This is not like you turn the TV on and you can just see, permanent cameras feed in the courtroom. It would be, you'd have to sign up for it, much like a public hearing. You'd have to sign up for the Zoom link, and the judge would grant it to you if the judge would determine that you would otherwise be able to attend that court proceeding. You might request it for something that's private and not and be denied, in which case there's zero broadcast happening whatsoever. And I say that only because there were other bills to broadcast the hearings themselves. And let me raise another important nuance here too. I would be remiss, and look, I can't predict what's going through the judges' minds as they weigh something like this. But there's another ancillary issue that's, I think, pretty important here. It's that once you make the decision to allow someone to watch a court proceeding via Zoom, there's a real question as to whether you can then restrain what that person does once they have that Zoom link. If I take pictures of the Zoom screen, or I record the audio from the Zoom feed as it's coming out, can you stop me, you, the court, or Maryland law, stop me from how I use that recording if I was otherwise legally allowed to hear that Zoom? This is a question that's actually before the courts pretty aggressively at the moment. That we had a couple cases. The Gun Trace Task Force, which is this wild police corruption case out of Baltimore. There was litigation over whether you could rebroadcast parts of audio that if you had taped it while legally attending those proceedings. And so there was litigation there. And the federal courts said Maryland's ban on broadcasting these court proceedings was constitutionally suspect. It came up again in the Capitol Gazette shooter trials when a podcast out of NPR wanted to play some clips. Again, they were legally allowed to attend the proceeding. And again, it's looking constitutionally suspect that Maryland is banning people from doing that. The courts have issued threats of contempt for reporters potentially trying to run some of these clips. And so, yes, it's a very interesting nuance.
Is the basis of that contempt argument that Maryland does not allow recording unless the other person consents?
Well, I don't think so. That's true too. We do have two-party consent required in Maryland, but there's actually also specific law prohibiting rebroadcast of court proceedings that are not authorized, and further court rules against such. And so if you're violating a court rule, a judge can certainly threaten to hold you in contempt of court. Now, as I understand it, they've never actually pulled this nuclear option, but it's been suggested as a threat. So much so that reporters have gone to the Attorney General for advice as to whether their republication of audio that was obtained legally of court proceedings would subject them to contempt of court charges. And he said, I can't clear this activity for you. And so that with that cloud, it's been an unfortunate aspect that the federal courts have had to step in and say, no, this is constitutionally suspect.
Oh, and is Maryland unique in this respect, or is it fairly common for state courts not to do allow rebroadcast?
It is common. Some are beginning to broadcast everything. With whatever the unintended consequences of that are. And again, this is you're talking about permanent broadcast as a sort of policy versus this bill is really trying to get at something in the middle, which is, again, it's access by request. Now, it might increase the likelihood that someone might therefore report it because, if you're sitting in your room, the privacy of your room with a Zoom feed going, it's not that hard to report it. Whereas I suppose in open court, you're a little more visible, but theoretically the risks are the same.
All right. Thank you, David Moon. We'll be following.
All right. Thanks so much.
You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Next up, Andtew Saundry talks to Gaithersburg City Mayor Jud Ashman about his takeaways from the last city elections.
Lost in a celestial field. Where did the others go? Where did our brothers go? When did we lose our way? An empire led to way.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Jud. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good. First of all, congratulations on winning re-election as mayor of Gaithersburg.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask, how did the election go in terms of the general administration of the election? How'd it go?
I actually thought it went great. This was an election unlike any other. We have never tried this sort of hybrid mail versus in-person election format before. The pandemic forced us to contemplate and implement some new things. And I thought they went exceedingly well. And we had a bigger turnout than we've had in a long, long time. Amazing.
What was the turnout in this election?
The total number of ballots cast was 4,836. Mm-hmm. And to put that in perspective, the 2019 election was 2,388, and that's the most comparable because it was largely uncontested. There were some write-ins, but it was officially uncontested. The last contested election we had was in 2017, and there were 3,396. So what we're looking essentially is a 46% increase in turnout and participation in this election over the last contested election.
Yeah. So what percentage of the voter pool is that?
It's 13.22% of the eligible registered voters.
Do you know what that is like relative to, say, Rockville or any of the other cities in Montgomery County?
Rockville's last election, which was administered a little differently from ours, mm-hmm. It was a fully by mail election. They did have voter drop boxes, but it was fully by mail. They had a 29% turnout. So we were lower than Rockville. We tend to be, even when no one's doing mail at all, we tend to be have a lower participation rate than Rockville to some degree.
Gotcha. Do you have a sense of why that is?
It's the most advantageous for us elected officials to say, yeah, people are pretty happy. And so when they're happy, they're a little complacent. But I don't know if that entirely explains it. Maybe the Gaithersburg population is more transient slightly than Rockville. Maybe in more, it tends to be, and this is anecdotal, but I find that in more established neighborhoods, where there's a history of issues, people are more aware and more participatory. And maybe that's, we're a little bit younger in terms of, I don't want to say we're younger in terms of when we were incorporated, but in terms of the growth of the city of Gaithersburg, Rockville had sort of built out and grown before we did. And so has had a little bit more time, I would say, from neighborhood to neighborhood to develop that history and get into the culture of politics at the local level there. But this is all just theoretical. I don't actually know.
So one of the hallmarks of these municipal elections, I know it's the same in Rockville, and I know it's the same in a lot of different cities, is that they are in these off years. They're in odd numbered years rather than even numbered years when you have the presidential and gubernatorial elections. So why is that?
We've had this discussion periodically over the years. I think it largely comes down to we want to keep them in off years because we don't want to be lost in the shuffle. And there's so much that's going on. We're in an election year now where we see a tremendous amount of activity at the county and at the state level. And then there's the presidential years, and just add that to the mix. So I think there are a number of different arguments, but I think it really comes down to municipalities not wanting to be lost in the shuffle.
Do you think having them in even numbered years would increase turnout? Do you think would increase or decrease the quality of the votes cast? I mean, if the concern is that you'd be lost in the shuffle, it sort of implies that, when you're voting in a gubernatorial or presidential election, you're not paying as much attention to the bottom of the ballot. Do you think that that's the case, or is there some other reason that it might end up, being consumed by another election?
Do I think that if we were to put it on the same year as presidential and as state elections, would we get more votes? I'm not sure. I honestly don't know because we haven't tried it. I don't know.
You had a hybrid election this cycle. Was it different from previous cycles? And is that something that you expect the city to continue with moving forward?
Yeah, so this is different. Technically, people could have voted by mail before, but it wasn't as if we were sort of soliciting that. So this time, the way the process worked was everybody got in the mail an application. If they wanted to vote by mail, they sent the application back, and then we sent them out a ballot, and they could either drop the ballot in the mail or they can drop it in, I think, 6 different drop boxes throughout the city. So that was different, and we did see higher turnout, higher participation. And so on January 31st, we had a work session with our Board of Supervisors of Elections, which is a volunteer group that helps advise us on and provide recommendations for how we conduct elections. And we decided, I think we are on the track that we're going to continue this. Even past the pandemic, we're going to continue offering this hybrid type election because we had a really good experience with it.
So why send ballot applications instead of just sending ballots to people?
It comes down to money.
2 mailings would be more expensive than 1, I would think.
Well, you would think, but there's different postage rates. And if you send out a ballot to a person, you have to send it first class mail. First class mail is a lot more expensive than bulk. So it could be as much of a difference between like a 55-cent mailing or a 50-cent mailing at first class pre-sorted rate versus a bulk rate of 20-something cents a piece. And not everybody wants to vote. You would be surprised. There was actually a substantial number of our voters wanted to come in and vote on election day, or in our smaller number, but we had a couple of early voting days in person. So not everybody wanted to do that, and basically the difference in the cost is substantial. I'm forgetting what the exact number was, but to put it in perspective, when we were just doing in-person elections in City Gaithersburg, it would cost $50,000 or $60,000 for us to conduct the election. This election cost us $160 something thousand using this hybrid manner.
Wow!
Because mailing is expensive. It's just mailing and printing are expensive. What it got us, as I said before, like 46% increase in turnout. So we were spending like 3 times as much. So it's like a 300% increase in cost gets us a 46% increase in turnout, which is not nothing. And I generally think it's money well spent. But Rockville, in order to do the full, so Rockville did what you're describing, where they just mailed out ballots to everybody. And they spent something like twice They spent $219,000 on their election versus the $160 that we spent on ours. So it's a $50,000 difference. With in government, you might say, okay, what's $50,000 in a budget? But for local government, it's real money. So yeah, it really comes down to financial considerations here.
That sort of leads me back to the off-year questions. Wouldn't it be cheaper then to have elections in even numbered years when you're already paying to have the polling places open and the drop boxes set up and all of the other costs that are associated with administration of an election?
Yeah, just sort of piggyback on the state and the county board of elections. Yeah, right. I mean, I see your point, and it's something we may have explored at some point. The discussion about holding off-year elections didn't come up this time. It's not. Mm-hmm. It wasn't really on people's minds. There hasn't really been a call for it. So we hadn't really analyzed it financially, but there's probably something to it. I would imagine that the county board of elections would charge the city to some degree because they'd have to print out and administer the process differently in Gaithersburg and mm-hmm. do it differently in Rockville for any of the municipal jurisdictions. But I don't know what that cost would be.
It's my understanding that for voting in person, there was only one site open. Do you think that worked for this election? Do you think it was too few sites? The
site was the Activity Center at Bort Park. It's pretty centrally located in the city of Gaithersburg. Parking is really easy. It's very easy to get to basically from anywhere. I like the site. I feel like this system that we implemented here gave a lot of flexibility for voters to vote the way they wanted. They didn't honestly have to go anywhere. They could just stick the ballot back in their mailbox if they want, at no cost to them. It's all postage mm-hmm. prepaid. If they didn't trust the post office, which that is a phenomenon these days, then we had drop boxes in 6 different parts of the city, sort of geographically evenly distributed. So it was not inconvenient for you to drop it off in one of the drop boxes. If you wanted to vote on a weekend as opposed to on a Tuesday, on actual election day, we had the 2 early voting days. They were at the one polling place. Mm-hmm. And anytime we've done early voting, we've always done it at one polling place. Mm-hmm. But I think there's also a financial element to it for us as well. It costs us less in staff time and we do pay our election judges. It's not exorbitant, but we do pay them, and it is a burden for election judges to work what is from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. In this case, it was much longer. We had a little bit of hiccup in counting the votes on election day. The counting actually went till like 2 or 3 in the morning. But it was kind of like a first time trying this hiccup that I think we would get better at next time. But either way, I think there are plenty of options. There's a lot of flexibility. People can vote where they want in very convenient ways. So I think the one polling place is just fine.
Okay. You said it took until 2 or 3 in the morning to count all of those votes. You expect that just to sort of resolve itself with more experience, or you think that there's something that needs to be done to, expedite that process, maybe start the counting earlier or what have you?
We were hit with a lot of last minute ballots drop. Well, a lot of people wanted to vote on election day more than we expected. And we also did not start counting the mailed in ballots until election day. And so at that point, I think there was an underestimation. They started a little bit late on bursting the ballots out of the envelopes because that had to be sort of a supervised, secure process. And it was a misjudgment in timing. Nothing went wrong with the equipment or with the process other than the timing was off. So we'll have to get better at that.
Okay. Do you think that there are things that the city could do differently that might increased turnout for future elections?
I don't know, but I'm open to this. It's something that we and other municipalities sort of wrestle with all of the time. I feel like this was a pretty heavily contested election. There were a number. I had one opponent, but there were 5 people running for city council, and they were all very active, and there was a lot of door knocking. Mm-hmm. So people were generally aware of the election, I think, to I guess compared favorably to any other election in memory, maybe since 2007 in Gaithersburg, and this is the turnout we got. I'm generally happy with the turnout, but yeah, it would be nice if we can do better. I don't know how. I'm open to ideas.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
Likewise. That was City of Gaithersburg Mayor Jud Ashman, interviewed by Andtew Saundry. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. This is the time I draw lessons from our conversations with our guests. But this week, I will leave it at the fact that we went from a global voice of Maria Nazarova to a national or state voice of David Moon, and finally to a local voice of Jud Ashman. A full scope of news from the global to the local. That's all for this episode. You've been listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from Bad Robot Jones, a Washington, D.C. area band of escaped androids on the run. Mixing punk, progressive, and indie rock, they play songs about assassin robots, Vulcan rituals, and the fall of galactic empires. Zach Parkman on vocals and guitar, Doogie Whittaker on bass and vocals, and Joey Jenkins on drums. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at ihppod@gmail.com or reach out on Twitter @ihppod. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and your home. See you next time.
Try to figure a way out of this lighthouse in my take my way out of this lighthouse, out of time.